To our second day of our Northern Latitudes Partnership Summit. I'm really, really excited for this upcoming panel in which we've invited Eli Enns and Dennis Nickerson to speak. So I will introduce them one by one. Eli is up first. So Eli Enns, he is a new friend and colleague, and I'm very, very honored to be learning from Eli and to be in these really awesome discussions together. So Eli is he is a member of the Cloquet First Nation in British Columbia, and he is the co-founder of the Isaak Olam Foundation. So you'll probably be hearing more about them over time, but Isaak Olam Foundation, it's an Indigenous non-governmental organization, and they're focused on capacity development and knowledge mobilization for the protection, conservation, and promotion of biocultural diversity, primarily through supporting the establishment, governance, and management of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. So for our Alaskan friends, we'll be hearing more about what IPCAs are from Eli today. And he has an insanely impressive resume. So I'll point out a few things and then I'll allow Eli to also introduce himself. He's also the co-founder of the Haukman, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, Eli. You can correct my pronunciation. It's a tribal park in the Clayoquot Sound UNESCO Biosphere Reserve on Vancouver Island. He's also been involved with the Clean Technology Community Gateway as their CEO and president, as well as Reconciliation Through Engineering initiative at the University of Toronto Centre for Global Engineering. He also, Isaak Olam Foundation is one of the co-hosts for the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, and he's a part of their leadership circle. And also a couple of the things that Eli has been involved with that we'll hear more about tomorrow as well when we talk about 30 by 30. And you'll hear that effort as described as the Pathway to Canada Target 1, which Alison Woodley will be talking about tomorrow. And Eli was the co-chair for the Indigenous Circle of Experts that had an extremely key role in that. And then finally, you're also going to hear more about our transboundary dialogues tomorrow. And Eli's been a really key collaborator and partner on that effort as well, and bringing forth Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship to those dialogues and to the recommendations that we are bringing forward to the Canadian and US federal governments. So really excited that you're here, Eli. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation to speak. And I'll let you continue introducing yourself to the group.
Thank you, Liana, and thank you to Shelley, Wade, and everybody who organized today. So my name's Eli Enns, and as Liana mentioned, I'm from Clayoquot, New Channel Nation on the west coast of Vancouver Island, here in Canada, on my father's side of my family. And my mother was born in St. Boniface, Winnipeg, Manitoba, and she grew up on a farm in the prairies. All of the initiatives that Liana spoke to are interconnected. You know, in the New Channel language, we have this worldview concept of Hishuk Ishtsawak and understanding the interconnection of all things, and that. You know, I also want to say that my great-grandfather, my father's grandfather, Harry Charlie, spent time in Alaska and brought songs home from there, which I'm reminded of by my relatives today. And so we have a connection there through my father's side of my family. So I went to university to study Canadian political science And I wanted to understand the evolution of the nation state that we call Canada, and particular interest around international dispute resolution. And what I found was that, somewhat to my surprise, really, was that Canada itself is a unique geopolitic that was co-founded through peace and friendship treaties. So in our constitution here in Canada, we still recognize those peace and friendship treaties as part of our constitution, which goes back to the formative wars, including the 7 Years' War and the War of 1812 that the Haudenosaunee Confederation participated in, and were pivotal in determining the outcomes of those conflicts. And so I want to start off my presentation today by sharing a map of Canada that is not often seen. This is a map of our constitution, or the constitutional features of Canada, the peace and friendship treaties that were required initially out of survival and military alliance, like I said, and then for economic prosperity with King George III, and then later out of a necessity of upholding the so-called honor of the crown. And so these peace and friendship treaties here in Canada have not been well honored, and I think this is a common story that is shared with some parts of the United States of America as well. And however, it was not that long ago. When we think about the time horizon of the way that our ancestors see the world, 150 years, 300 years is not that long. And so we're still living, as my niece Giselle Martin says, we're still living in the period of early contact. When you consider the fact that our societies have, through the proven archaeological record, a track record of over 10,000 years of resilience. And so the past few hundred years is still a part of our early contact, and we're still here and practicing the teachings of our ancestors. And one of the highlights for my talk today is to share with you this concept of ethical space. And so this is about bringing together the best of Indigenous knowledge systems with the best of Western science for the conservation of nature in ethical space where one does not dominate the other. And I think of Dr. Reg Crowshoe from Alberta, and he's the fellow who brought this idea of ethical space. He and Danica Littlechild brought this idea of ethical space to the Pathway to Canada Target 1 that Leanna mentioned, that will be spoken about by Alison Woodley tomorrow. And the way that he had described it was that you take the idea was like a framework, like a window frame that you look through. And on one side, you have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. You also, here in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission 94 calls to action. And then the third element of that frame is Section 35 of the Canada Act of 1982, which recognized and affirmed pre-existing Aboriginal and treaty rights in this country and entrenched them further into the Constitution, the highest law of Canada. Now, the fourth part of that framework is kind of interchangeable depending on the subject matter that you're looking at. So for example, you could apply the concept of ethical space to the delivery of health programs or housing, a variety of different subject matters. But in this particular case, Crowshoe and Littlechild were bringing the concept of ethical space to the creation of parks and protected areas and the conservation of biological diversity more broadly. And so in that context, we use the United Nations the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, and particularly the Aichi targets in this case, which Aichi Target 11 is Canada Target 1. Which has come and gone with the sunset of those targets on December 31st, 2020. And so this, one of the things that Crowshoe really wanted us to understand out of this framework was that rather than recreating the wheel every time we enter into an intergovernmental dialogue, these are the areas that have been already agreed upon. UNDRIP, the 94 calls to action of the TRC, Section 35, and this pre-existing United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. So understanding that all of our future dialogue is building upon that existing understanding where treaty and Aboriginal rights are already recognized. They're entrenched in the Constitution. And so we shouldn't be, spending this time arguing the applicability of treaty within the context of biological diversity conservation. And the other thing about ethical space is that it's a safe place where these two different knowledge systems can come together and not worry about one dominating the other. But to look at complementariness and look at how Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science can each contribute its strengths to mutually beneficial solutions, for our generation, but also the unborn generations to come. And so this idea of ethical space in the modern day context, in light of what I said in my opening statements, is an ongoing effort by Indigenous scholars and thought leaders such as Crowshoe and Danica Littlechild in this early era of contact to still hold out that olive branch to our treaty partners who many of them have forgotten the history of treaty in this country. They've forgotten that the time when we needed each other and that we agreed to live in parallel sovereignty in peaceful coexistence. The treaty at Fort Niagara in 1764, and the many peace and friendship treaties that followed. Essentially, we're dealing with a treaty partner that is suffering a kind of amnesia, that they don't understand their obligations. They don't recall their obligations to the peace and friendship treaties that made Canada possible in the first place. And furthermore, many of them don't know who they are themselves. And this is where the sort of fundamental starting point in many conversations is an understanding. Do you understand who you are? What is your history? What is the history, for example, of the province of British Columbia? How can we have a conversation about the future if we don't know our past? And for example, this year, 2021, we're hardly marking 150 years of Confederation, where the colonies of Vancouver Island and New Caledonia joined forces to negotiate terms of union with the Dominion of Canada, which effectively fortified the 49th parallel from American expansionism north and west along the Pacific Rim in mainland British Columbia today up to Alaska, which of course around that time was Russian North America in the 1850s and 60s and such. And so how can we speak with, how can we have a nation-to-nation relationship when we're dealing with folks who don't know who they are or the history of the governments that they represent? And so IPCAs and this concept of ethical space is an olive branch to that treaty partner to say that it's not too late to start exercising good relationship, not only with one another, but with the land. And so the concept of ethical space was a pivotal paradigm shift for the Pathway to Canada Target 1, and that along with a variety of efforts of different actors and committees within the process, were able to come up with a new jurisdictional designation here in Canada called, that is now known as Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. This idea of IPCAs goes back to really the heart and soul of it goes back to time immemorial. And Liana mentioned in her introduction of me the mandate of the Isaak Olam Foundation, which is around biocultural heritage conservation and biocultural diversity conservation. Well, this goes back to time immemorial when our ancestors governed and managed our lands, not for sustainability, but for abundance. And and as many of you may know already, at the time of early contact with Europeans here in the Pacific Northwest, there was a great abundance of biological diversity that was the outcome and net result of thousands of years of sophisticated economic practices of our ancestors. And so when I use the word economy, I'm using it in the classical definition of the word and its history that goes back to the Greek language. The word economy is related to the words ecology and ecosystem. And so our ancestors, I mean, the word economy, the root word of these three words, eco, comes from the Greek language and a word, oikos or ekos, which means home. But it's not it's not a physical house with doors and windows. It's an all-encompassing home. This more akin to what we think of as a biosphere today, and so ecology is the study of the home and the interrelations. There's different types of ecosystems. And what then does the word economy mean? Well, it means the wise and prudent management of the home. And our ancestors had these simple but powerful hacks or solutions on how to first observe nature. Observe how Mother Nature organizes herself in relation to the sun and the moon, how life behaves and interacts, and then how can we learn similarly to this idea of biomimicry in advanced textiles and other types of technologies that our ancestors learned how to govern our own relationship to the land through observing nature and natural law. And through this observation and practice, we could design very advanced human economies that resulted in a great abundance of biological diversity. And I would direct, if anyone's interested in learning more, Ronald Trosper, a Harvard economist, in 2009 published a book called Resilience, Reciprocity, and Ecological Economics. And Trosper was looking at the ancient civilizations of the Pacific Northwest that still exist to this day. And so we're employing these ideas, these advanced, tried, tested, and true understandings of economy and relationship to land in a new jurisdictional designation that we're calling Indigenous Protected and Conserved Areas. Now, bear in mind, there may be some out there who want to put IPCAs into a more familiar box, to say, look, why can we not make these like a national park, but instead of having non-Indigenous rangers, we have Indigenous guardians. And I think that if that is the way that the people want to go, if that's what the nation wants, then that's for them to do. But the opportunity with IPCAs is to take it one step further and to really embrace the idea of Hishak Ishtsawak. Everything is one and everything is interconnected. It's not just guardians. What is the role of elders and youth, and how would we build our villages differently? Learning from the teachings of our ancestors on our architectural inspiration combined with high performance building technologies of today. You could think of it like ethical space housing or IPCA eco-village concept, where we look at about rethinking every aspect of the human community, the built environment, as it integrates and coexists within a natural ecosystem. You know, potable water distribution infrastructure, liquid and solid waste management infrastructure, food systems, energy systems. We have to be complete. And essentially what we're talking about here is a model of microeconomics or regional development that has a high priority placed on nature conservation or biological diversity. And so IPCAs, although, although they are kind of a born in Canada social innovation, we're getting a lot of interest from different folks in the United States and in Central America, and as far down as South America in the IPCA model. But there's also a global movement of ICCAs, Indigenous peoples and community conserved territories and areas, or territories of life. ICCAs are similar to IPCAs in many ways. And so this is a global movement of similar initiative. And so, yeah, I mean, the ethical space model, the IPCAs, those were a couple of the major outcomes. One of the things we recognized, and you'll learn more about this tomorrow, but the Canadian government has committed to protecting 25% of the country by 2025 and 30 by 2030. And we're currently sitting at 12.8%. So we've got a long ways to go. And we have a fairly short time period to achieve that. And and so one of the things we recognized early on is the need for capacity development and knowledge mobilization to take those examples where we have a few decades already underway, such as the tribal parks initiatives or the IPAs in Northwest Territories or such, uh, and mobilize the lessons learned and the successes and the failures of those to others who are interested in doing it. Developing curriculum based on the lessons learned. We're partnered up with the Vancouver Island University here to develop an IPCA planning certificate. We also have a Canada-wide, as Leanna mentioned, the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, which is focused on working with post-secondary institutions in knowledge mobilization and capacity development for the establishment, governance, and management of IPCAs. And so the mandate, it's a 7-year project. $3.5 million is what we're able to get so far. It expires, the mandate expires in 2025. We might have a couple bonus years because of COVID. But anyways, regardless, we have to get focused on our legacy outcomes. And one of the legacy outcomes that is relevant to this audience is that we aim to create a network of IPCA innovation centers across Canada. And so we're starting in the Pacific region, and there's already been a bit of media coverage to it, but we haven't done a formal launch yet. But we're going to be launching the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center in the coming months. The initial push is focused on the Canadian Pacific regions, but our longer term goal is to give life to a coastal initiative from Alaska all the way down to Patagonia in South America, called the Emerald Necklace of the Pacific. The Emerald Necklace of the Pacific is the sort of charismatic narrative of program rollout of the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center. Currently, some strong, promising partnerships under development in Costa Rica and in San Francisco. But we're not even publicly launched yet. So, I mean, there's still a lot of time left in the future to further those developments. And essentially what that's going to be is that the necklace has several large stones, each representing an innovation center or a campus of the Pacific IPCA Innovation Center. And then the smaller stones on the necklace represent IPCA innovations themselves along the Pacific Rim. And so, make a note of that for yourselves, whether as a collective or as individuals or the organizations that you represent. If there's interest in participating in the future of IPCA innovation throughout the Pacific Rim, we're definitely open to collaboration. So I think I hit all of the sweet spots, Leanna, that had been highlighted in the invitation there. But if I missed any, important things, feel free to prod me. And also, I don't know what your schedule's like for questions and answers, but people can put it in the chat or put their hand up or whatever.
Thanks, Eli. I think it would actually be nice to have a few minutes for questions now, because that was a lot of amazing information, and we'll hear more from Dennis. And while it's fresh in your minds, it might be good to have a few moments for some Q&A. Is that okay, Shelley? She's the facilitator.
Sounds good. But the only thing I will say is, friends, welcome the adaptable, fluid process, because it's happening live and it's awesome. And we feel super lucky to have Eli here. So yeah, go for it.
Indigenous guardians. Okay. Yeah, I mentioned that.
Anyone can jump in verbally or raise your hand or throw something in the chat.
All right. Sounds like somebody wants to join the Innovation Center. Yes, let's have a follow-up workshop about that specifically in the coming months.
That would be amazing.
I have a question, Eli. My name is Curtis Rattray. I'm with the Tahltan Nation.
Awesome.
And I'm also on the steering committee of Northwest Boreal Partnership. And anyway, I've heard your name before through Tero Mustonen. And I really enjoyed your points. I've taken down quite a bit of notes. The idea of economy is really similar to the way I'm thinking, that I do use the term Tahltan economy or indigenous economy as a way of trying to capture the kind of thing that I envision for our land use, our relationship with the land, right? And so anyway, so those are the types of things that I think we've got a lot of commonalities in the way we think. I've also studied political science too, so I'm a political scientist like you. But I'm just kind of wondering, like through Tero, I've learned about ICCAs. He talked me into going into their AGM in India a couple of years ago, and I was really fascinated with what they were doing because of Hugo out of Taiwan and Hugo's ideas about indigenous sovereignty. And so I had the chance, and that was the main reason why we wanted to go there, is to sit one-on-one with Hugo and pick his brain about indigenous sovereignty and those kinds of concepts. But I do like the idea of ICCAs. And when I looked at the reading that I've been doing on ICPAs in Canada, I was a little concerned with, very concerned with it being too constrained within the concept of Canada as a nation state versus ICCAs, which were more of an international thing. And what really grabbed my attention with ICCAs is that they're all community driven. And the thing about it is that those communities recognize each other, which is a really important concept of international politics right now. Like, for example, Taiwan is not considered a member of the community of nations because nobody recognizes them. And so being recognized is a critical component of sovereignty and being having this self-determination. And I find ICCAs are a lot more along those lines versus ICPA. So I was wondering what your thoughts were around that.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, an IPCA is Indigenous-led. And that actually, because the ICE committee was made up with federal government agencies, provincial government representatives, territorial government representatives. And that was probably the hardest point to negotiate, was that this is Indigenous-led. So it doesn't require the recognition of the provinces or the federal government. And in fact, most IPCA type initiatives in Canada are not recognized by the state. That being said, as I mentioned, maybe it was in this talk, sorry, I've done a couple Zoom presentations today, but when I studied political science here in Canada, one of the things that I was surprised to learn was that Canada itself is an Indigenous state. It was created through peace and friendship treaties. Now, if you think back to January of 2020, before the pandemic started, you may recall that the entire country was being locked down in a series of blockades across all of Canada. And the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte Thaindanega read out a letter. It's probably still available online, but it's a letter that they wrote to the Queen because they still remember the treaty relationships that founded this country. Because King George III had his tail between his legs because he lost the American Revolutionary War. And he was following the French, fleeing north and receding into his treaty relationships. And it was the Haudenosaunee Confederation that sheltered him, and the loyalists to King George from the United States of America. Again, in the War of 1812, King George activated his treaty relationships with the Haudenosaunee. For better or worse, that's the history of this country. Otherwise, King George would not have survived in the North. And so in 2020, the Mohawks of the Bay of Quinte read out the letter about the Silver Covenant Agreement, and are still holding out that olive branch to their treaty partners. Treaty partners in the Treaty of Fort Niagara in 1764, and many other peace and friendship treaties since. And so when I look at, and I volunteered for the ICCA consortium for about 7 years, Curtis. And, I think that there's been a tremendous amount of work done by the ICCA folks on creating space for Indigenous-led conservation at the IUCN level, the CBD level, pretty much everywhere you turn around in the international spheres, you've got dedicated HQPs from the ICCA consortium forwarding that. And when I looked at what I could offer the world, the most powerful tool that I have available to me to do good in the world is Canada itself. And so, and this for me goes all the way back to my early, education and what Canada is, because I had bought in. I mean, growing up between Manitoba and BC, I certainly am not ignorant of the negative side of police brutality and the injustice in the Canadian justice system, and the inequities in access to resources, and the environmental insecurity and toxic. There's a long ways to go here, and so when I was studying international dispute resolution and in Canada and world politics, one of the things I came across was this idea of nation building and what Canada was doing in nation building abroad, which is about establishing infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, production facilities for natural resource extraction, educational infrastructure for teaching foreign peoples how to speak English. This is a neo-colonialism. And so for me, I looked internal to Canada and how we can do nation rebuilding right here in Canada. And through strengthening our Indigenous nations here in Canada, who are, like I mentioned in the outset, they're not my nation. Like, my nation never signed treaty, but by and large, like the map I just showed you here, this country is has many peace and friendship treaties, and there's ongoing roles and responsibilities for Indigenous nations to make Canada great again.
Eli, everybody just went, what?
Sorry, I couldn't resist. But
I love it.
But definitely, like I mentioned though, Curtis, the Canada's oldest IPCA, IPCA type initiative is the Mears Island Tribal Park, where I'm from. And this poster that's behind me is from 1984. And those trees are still standing to this day. Although that tribal park was never recognized by the province or the federal government. So it is like dealing with, like I said, you've got a 10,000-year-old society that's working with a 150-year-old society. There's a lot of hand-holding and a lot of education that's needed.